Hey there. Tonight, we are going to leave the bright lights and the loud noises of the modern world far behind us. We are going to step back into the deep frost and the heavy shadows of the ancient North. Forget the polished heroes you have seen on bright screens or read about in cheerful books. The truth of the old gods is much heavier and much darker than the modern tales suggest. We will speak of a heavy iron hammer forged in the suffocating heat of a dying star, with a fatal flaw built into its handle. We will speak of a massive serpent so incredibly large that it crushes the ocean floor and poisons the very sea it swims in with its toxic breath. We will speak of a god of thunder whose ultimate and inescapable destiny is to walk exactly 9 steps across a ruined battlefield before his strong heart finally stops beating from a terrible venom. If finding comfort in these ancient shadows and these slow, tragic cycles helps you rest your tired mind, please leave a like and subscribe to join us on this long journey. Tell me where you are resting tonight, and let the quiet connection of shared stories bring you a deep and heavy peace. Now it is time to turn down the lights in your room. Let the heavy darkness of the space settle around you like a thick woolen blanket draped over your weary shoulders. Breathe in the cool air of the room and feel it slowly fill the deep spaces of your lungs. Breathe out all the tension and all the rushing anxiety you have carried throughout the long day. Let your jaw soften and drop slightly. Let your hands unclench from tight fists and rest easily and loosely by your sides. You are completely safe here in the dark. You are perfectly hidden from the demands of the waking world. Your mind is drifting back to a time long before human history was ever written down on paper or carved into stone. We are traveling back to a vast and terrifying cosmos, held together only by the massive twisting roots and heavy branches of an unimaginable ash tree called Yggdrasil. Think about the sheer scale of this ancient tree. Its roots reach down into the absolute freezing darkness of the void where there is no light and no warmth. The bark of the tree is thick and rough and ancient beyond human comprehension. Slow rivers of thick golden sap flow sluggishly beneath the surface of the wood, carrying the vital energy of creation itself. The universe is a very fragile and dangerous place. In the center of this great tree sits the ordered world, where gods and mortals attempt to build their warm halls and light their small fires to keep the darkness at bay. But outside that small center of order is the wild. It is a place of primordial cold and jagged, unforgiving stone. It is the dark realm of the giants and the ancient monsters who wait patiently in the shadows. They represent the absolute forces of chaos. They are the slow, creeping entropy that constantly wants to tear down the walls of civilization and return everything to the freezing, empty void of the beginning. The high gods of Asgard knew that wisdom and magic alone could not hold back this endless tide of chaos forever. They needed a physical shield. They needed a living weapon made of dense flesh and heavy bone to stand in the doorway and fight back the dark. The supreme ruler of this ordered central world was a figure named Odin. He was the All-Father and the undisputed master of deep wisdom. He was a god of subtle magic and complex war and endless calculating thought. His sharp mind was always moving across the vast spaces of the 9 realms, looking for threats and searching for hidden knowledge. He sat high in a tower made of silver and gold, looking out over the mists of the world. The cold wind blew through his gray beard and chilled his single-seeing eye. His black ravens flew constantly through the freezing skies to bring him whispered secrets from the darkest corners of creation. You can almost hear the soft rustling of their black feathers as they glide silently through the cold air. But Odin was essentially a creature of the open sky and the shifting mind. He understood that the physical defense of the world required something much more grounded and solid than spells and thoughts. It required absolute and terrifying physical strength. It required a heavy, brutal force that did not hesitate or scheme or plan, but simply acted with raw, devastating power. To create this perfect, unyielding defender, Odin did not choose a beautiful goddess of the sky or a shifting spirit of the clouds. He needed mass. He needed gravity. He chose to unite with the heavy earth itself. Odin sought out a primordial and ancient entity named Jord. She was the literal personification of the unyielding ground beneath our feet. She was the deep, dark soil and the heavy, solid bedrock that anchors the mountains. She was the unseen force that pushed massive stones up from the planetary crust and caused the very ground to shake and tremble. Her essence was bound in the wet mud and the thick clay and the dark, blind roots that reached endlessly down into the cold abyss. She did not live in the sky. She lived in the dirt. This union between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother was not a matter of fleeting romance or soft affection. It was a deliberate and calculated cosmic arrangement designed to forge a protector. Odin combined his divine soaring authority with the pure raw mass of the primitive earth. He took the electricity of the sky and buried it deep in the wet soil. The result of this monumental union was a son who possessed the heavy, unbreakable reality of solid stone, combined perfectly with the terrifying, explosive energy of the summer storm. This son was Thor. Unlike the other ethereal divine beings who were born in the golden shining halls of Asgard, and who spent their long days in quiet contemplation and political maneuvering, Thor was born with one heavy foot firmly planted in the wet dirt of the mortal world. He was incredibly dense. He was unimaginably heavy. His earthly heritage manifested immediately in his physical form from the very moment he drew his first breath. He possessed a sheer physical strength that completely baffled and frightened the other older gods. When he cried out as a small infant, the sound did not echo lightly like a normal voice in the golden halls. Instead, it rumbled and vibrated like massive boulders grinding together deep underground in the dark. The low vibrations of his voice actually shook the solid foundations of the divine towering palaces. His small infant grasping hands possessed such terrifying density that they could casually crush solid objects that fully grown veteran warriors struggled to even lift. The other gods stood back and watched this child with a strange mixture of deep awe and quiet unease. They could literally feel the heat and the static electricity radiating from his small, thick body. They quickly recognized the ancient signs written clearly in his physical flesh. The ancient, mysterious weavers of fate who sat at the base of the great tree had prophesied long ago that this specific child would become the primary bulwark against the invading giants. She was born specifically and intentionally to stand as a living wall of muscle and bone between the warm fires of civilization and the freezing, screaming wilderness of the void. As the years passed, Thor grew into a massive and towering figure. He did not look anything like the ethereal, magical beings of the high courts, who wore fine silks and walked with silent steps. He looked exactly like a violent force of nature given a rough human shape. His chest was as broad as a mountain ridge, and his arms were thick like the trunks of ancient oak trees. His most striking and defining feature was the wild mane of his hair and his thick, tangled beard. They were completely and shockingly red. In the ancient culture of the cold north, the color red was not just a simple description of a visual pigment. It was a profound symbol of raw, supernatural, unbridled power. It was the color of fresh blood spilled on the muddy battlefield. It was the color of the blazing, roaring fire that kept the deadly winter cold at bay during the longest nights of the year. Above all things, it was the color of the sky tearing violently open during a massive thunderstorm. When the ancient mortal people stood in their fields and saw the jagged lightning flash across the dark, heavy clouds, they truly believed they saw the fiery red beard of their great protector blazing in the dark. But this red fire was not a purely destructive force. A wild forest fire burns everything it touches to gray ash and leaves absolutely nothing behind but ruin. Thor represented a different kind of energy. He represented the controlled, necessary fire. He was the warm hearth fire that cooks the daily food and warms the small home against the winter chill. The seasonal storms he brought across the land were indeed violent and incredibly loud, but they always ended with heavy, life-giving rain falling gently on the dry, desperate fields. The loud lightning cracked the sky and terrified the animals, but it also enriched the soil and allowed the seeds to germinate. His earthly mother, Jord, received the heavy rain from her powerful son, and as a result, the crops grew tall and green and strong. He was absolutely the ruthless destroyer of monsters and giants, but he was also simultaneously the gentle bringer of the harvest. He possessed a profound dual nature that made his existence absolutely essential to the survival of all living, breathing things in the Middle Realm. The dynamic relationship between the Skyfather and the Earthborn Son completely defined the delicate balance of the universe. Odin stood far above and observed the cosmos from his high, distant seat, plotting grand, complex strategies over centuries. He used subtle trickery and magical illusions and political shifting to achieve his long-term goals without ever lifting a sword. Thor had absolutely no patience for trickery or illusions. His deep, earthborn instincts drove him constantly toward immediate and direct action. When a dark threat appeared on the distant horizon, Thor did not send silent spies into the shadows or weave complex magical traps. He simply grasped his weapons and walked directly toward the danger. He was the blunt enforcement arm of the complex divine will. He was the heavy stone door that slammed shut with finality against the starving wolves howling in the winter night. To fulfill this massive and eternal responsibility, Thor required tools and weapons that perfectly matched his own density and his violent power. Ordinary weapons made of standard mortal iron or bronze would instantly shatter into 1,000 useless pieces the very moment he gripped them with his full raging strength. He needed ancient artifacts born from the exact same extreme violent conditions that forged the stars and the planets. He needed items of impossible physical weight and deep magical resilience. The story of exactly how he obtained these legendary tools is not a soaring tale of a noble quest or a wholly quiet pilgrimage. The greatest and most devastating arsenal in the entire history of the Nine Realms was actually born from a petty and cruel act of simple mischief carried out in the dead of the dark night. It started with a quiet, cowardly betrayal in the private sleeping quarters of his own peaceful home. You can slowly feel the heavy anticipation hanging thick in the air around you. The loud thunder is definitely coming, but it always starts with a creeping, heavy silence. Rest your tired eyes now and let the low sound of the approaching storm lull you deeper and deeper into the safe dark. Allow your heavy limbs to sink further into the soft mattress beneath you as we prepare to enter the unbearable heat of the subterranean forge. The story continues down in the dark earth, where the true power is hammered out of the raw rock. Just keep breathing slowly and steadily as the shadows grow longer and the ancient world becomes more real than the room around you. The heavy absolute silence of the long night was broken by a cruel and completely silent act. Thor was married to a beautiful goddess named Sif. She was renowned and celebrated across all the varied realms for her magnificent flowing hair. Her hair was not simply a mundane shade of blonde. It was a literal flowing river of pure golden light. It cascaded down her back and over her shoulders, exactly like the thick golden wheat that sways gently in the warm fields during the final lazy days of summer. It represented the fertile yielding earth and the glorious abundance of the autumn harvest. Sif slept peacefully in her private chambers. The large stone room was completely quiet, and the cool night air was entirely still. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic pattern of deep restorative sleep. A dark, shifting shadow moved silently through the perimeter of the room. It was Loki. He was a complex being of pure chaos and endless trickery who lived among the high gods. His sharp mind was always turning with a restless, malicious energy that he could never fully control. He crept slowly toward the sleeping goddess, with a very sharp and cold blade held tightly in his hand. He moved with such supernatural grace that he did not make a single sound on the hard stone floor. He leaned carefully over the wooden bed and gently gathered the long golden strands of her hair into his hands. The cold, sharp metal of the blade slid smoothly and quickly through the magical hair. He severed the beautiful glowing locks entirely from her scalp and left her head completely bare and exposed to the chill of the room. He quickly gathered the stolen golden hair into his arms and vanished back into the deep shadows long before the sun could even begin to rise over the horizon. When the morning light finally came, the terrible discovery was made. Sif awoke from her deep sleep and immediately felt the cold, unyielding air resting directly on her bare skin. Her loud cries of deep anguish and pure sorrow echoed wildly through the long stone corridors of the divine stronghold. Thor heard the desperate cries of his wife, and a terrifying absolute rage rose up inside his massive chest. It was not a sudden burst of hot anger. It was a slow building atmospheric pressure that felt exactly like the heavy, suffocating air right before a massive, violent thunderstorm. The air in the stone halls grew noticeably thick and suddenly tasted faintly of metallic copper and burning ozone. Thor found the trickster Loki and seized him violently by the neck with a crushing grip that could easily pulverize solid boulders into fine dust. The eyes of the thunder god burned with the silent promise of absolute final destruction. Loki was entirely terrified for his life. The desperate trickster promised wildly that he would find a way to completely restore the lost golden hair. He swore an oath that he would travel far down into the deepest and darkest parts of the earth to find the legendary master craftsman who could fix his terrible, foolish mistake. Thor slowly released his crushing grip, and Loki immediately fled downward away from the light. He left the high, airy, and beautiful realms of the gods and descended quickly into the dark, heavy crust of the primitive earth. He traveled down to a deep subterranean place called Svartalfheim. This was the ancient and hidden realm of the dwarves. It was a vast underground world of endless winding caverns and suffocating oppressive heat. The harsh smell of burning sulfur and roasting coal was everywhere in the thick air. Slow-moving rivers of bright orange molten magma flowed sluggishly through deep trenches carved directly into the black volcanic rock. The rhythmic sound of heavy metal, hammers striking solid iron anvils, rang out in a continuous, deafening and hypnotic rhythm. The dwarves were the undisputed greatest smiths in all of creation. They possessed ancient secrets of deep metallurgy that allowed them to weave actual raw magic directly into heavy physical objects. Loki eventually found a specific group of incredibly skilled craftsmen, known as the Sons of Ivaldi. He used his silver tongue to convince them to spin brand new hair for Sif out of pure, solid gold. The master dwarves took the raw yellow metal and worked it over their fires until it was thinner than a delicate spider web, but somehow stronger than thick iron chains. They carefully enchanted the golden threads so that they would magically attach to the head of the goddess and grow naturally, just like real living hair. While they were working their incredible magic, they also decided to craft a heavy spear that would magically never miss its intended target, and a beautiful magical ship that could fold up small enough to fit inside a simple leather pocket. Loki was immensely pleased with these wonderful gifts, but his inherently arrogant nature caused him to make a very foolish and dangerous wager. He wandered further into the caverns and found two other famous dwarven brothers named Brucker and Sindri. He loudly boasted to their faces that they could never possibly create anything as magnificent or as powerful as the magical items he had just obtained. The two proud brothers took the arrogant insult very personally. They immediately accepted the challenge without hesitation. They demanded that Loki pledge his own head to them if they succeeded in forging better and more powerful artifacts. The two serious brothers walked with heavy purpose to their great forge. The ambient heat in their dark workshop was already intense enough to melt ordinary surface stone into liquid sludge. Sindri, who was the master smith of the two, placed a piece of raw pig skin directly into the heart of the roaring furnace. He then handed the massive leather handles of the bellows to his brother Brokkr. The bellows were giant leather lungs used to pump fresh oxygen continuously into the fire to increase the heat. Sindri looked his brother in the eyes and told him strictly that he must pump the bellows without stopping for even a single fraction of a second. The intense temperature inside the furnace had to remain absolutely and perfectly consistent for the magic to properly bind with the material. Brokkr gripped the leather handles and began to pump with his muscular arms. The fire roared loudly and quickly turned a blinding shade of pure white. Loki hid nearby and watched from the dark shadows of the cavern. He slowly realized that his own life was in grave danger if these master smiths succeeded in their task. He used his dark magic to transform his physical body into a large, aggressive, biting fly. The black fly buzzed angrily through the sweltering, suffocating air of the dwarven forge. It flew directly toward the dwarf working the heavy bellows. It landed softly on the exposed hand of Brokkr and bit down hard into his thick skin. The pain of the bite was sharp and very sudden, but Brokkr was a master of his craft, and he did not stop pumping the leather handles. The steady, rhythmic flow of the air continued without interruption, and the white fire burned bright and hot. Sindri confidently reached his bare hand into the roaring flames and pulled out a living, breathing boar with thick bristles made of glowing, radiant gold. They had perfectly succeeded with their first magical creation. Sindri then turned and placed a large chunk of pure, solid gold into the intense fire and gave the exact same strict instructions to his brother. The dark fly returned from the shadows and landed directly on the side of the neck of the working dwarf. It bit down into the flesh twice as hard as before. The pain burned sharply like a hot, glowing coal pressed firmly against his bare skin. But Brocker simply gritted his teeth and kept his thick arms moving in a steady rhythm. He pumped the heavy leather handles back and forth without breaking the crucial rhythm for even a moment. Sindri smiled and pulled a heavy golden ring from the heart of the fire. This magical ring would perfectly multiply itself every 9th night to ensure eternal boundless wealth for whoever wore it. There was only one final item left to forge to win the terrible wager. Sindri walked to a dark corner of the room and returned, holding a chunk of rare dark iron. He placed it carefully into the very center of the roaring furnace. This was not ordinary iron pulled from the common dirt of the earth. It was celestial, ancient metal harvested directly from the cold, dense core of a fallen dead star. It was incredibly heavy, and it required a heat so profoundly extreme that the stone walls of the forge itself threatened to melt and collapse. Sindri looked very seriously at his sweating brother and warned him that a single tiny mistake now would completely ruin the cosmic masterpiece. Brocker planted his feet firmly on the stone floor and began to pump the massive bellows with absolutely all his remaining physical strength. The roaring fire changed color and turned an impossible shade of deep blue. The sheer heat radiating outward from the furnace severely blistered the tough skin on the face of the dwarf. Loki watched with mounting terror, because he knew this was his absolute last chance to save his own head from the executioner's block. The desperate fly buzzed wildly and aggressively around the head of the dwarf. It landed directly between his eyes, resting perfectly on his sensitive eyelid. The frantic insect bit down with a vicious and terrified energy. The sharp, painful sting pierced deep through the delicate, thin skin. Warm, thick red blood immediately welled up from the fresh wound. The blood ran quickly down into the eye of the dwarf and completely blinded him in that moment. The sudden, sharp pain and the absolute loss of sight were totally overwhelming to his senses. For just a tiny fraction of a single second, Brocker let go of the leather bellows with one hand to quickly wipe the blinding blood from his eye. The heavy leather lung paused its movement. The steady rushing flow of oxygen stopped. The blue fire flickered slightly and dropped in temperature for just a single moment. Sindri saw the mistake and rushed frantically to the furnace to pull the dark iron out before the magic failed. The heavy metal hissed and screamed loudly as he plunged it deep into the cold, cooling trough. Thick white steam filled the dark stone cavern and obscured everything from view. When the hot smoke finally cleared away, the two brothers stood in silence and looked down at their final creation. It was a massive and brutally heavy iron hammer. The rectangular head of the hammer was absolutely flawless. It was a solid block of dense, dark star metal that literally hummed with terrifying, destructive cosmic potential. But the handle attached to it was completely wrong, because the blue fire had flickered for that one moment. The handle had formed entirely too short. It was unbalanced and awkward. It was, unfortunately, a one-handed weapon that clearly should have required two massive hands to lift properly. It looked to the untrained eye like a deeply flawed creation. Despite the noticeably short handle, the heavy iron hammer was a true masterpiece of cosmic devastating power. The proud dwarves named it Mjolnir. It possessed deep enchantments that completely defied the normal laws of the physical natural world. When it was thrown in anger, it would absolutely never miss its intended target. More importantly, it would always magically and violently return to the waiting hand of the exact person who threw it. It contained enough raw power to level entire ancient mountain ranges and to summon the most violent electrical storms the world had ever witnessed. The dwarven brothers traveled up to the realm of the gods and presented this flawed but perfect weapon directly to Thor. When the massive thunder god wrapped his thick, calloused fingers around the surprisingly short iron handle, the cosmic connection was immediate and undeniable. The heavy dark metal resonated perfectly with the thick blood rushing through his veins. But the hammer was so incredibly dense, and the magical electrical feedback was so extremely violent, that even the mighty Thor could not wield it safely with his bare, unprotected hands. The raw, untamed energy of the star metal would literally burn the skin and muscle right from his strong bones. To protect him from his own weapon, the dwarves presented 2 more magical items to complete the arsenal. The first item was a pair of thick, heavy iron gauntlets, named Jarngriper. These heavy metal gloves insulated his hands completely and allowed him to grip the short handle tightly without being destroyed by the massive electrical storms the hammer constantly generated. The second magical item was a remarkably heavy and thick belt called Mjolnir. When Thor securely fastened the thick metal and leather strap tightly around his broad waist, a massive surge of magical adrenaline flooded violently into his biological system. The belt effectively doubled his already incomprehensible and terrifying physical strength. It allowed him to casually lift the massive dead weight of the star metal hammer and swing it through the air with enough absolute force to shatter the crust of the earth. Thor stood tall and proud in the shining halls of Asgard, fully equipped for his dark and heavy destiny. He wore the thick belt of strength pulled tight across his midsection. His large hands were completely encased in the thick, dark iron gloves. His thick fingers were wrapped firmly and securely around the short, stubby handle of the greatest weapon ever forged. He was no longer just a simple god of the sky or the weather. He was now the ultimate physical weapon of the entire ordered universe. You can hear the distant rhythmic ringing of the hammer on the anvil slowly fading away into the absolute quiet of the night. Let that steady, heavy rhythm pull your tired, wandering thoughts all the way down into the warm, deep earth as you drift away into a long, dreamless sleep. The ancient and bitter war between the bright gods of order and the massive giants of chaos was not a simple matter of disputed borders or stolen gold. It was a fundamental and eternal struggle between the warm light of early civilization and the absolute freezing darkness of the unformed void. Thor was the designated heavy champion of the warm light. He spent his long centuries marching out into the rocky, desolate wastes to hunt down the physical, terrifying embodiments of creeping entropy. There are many stories of his brutal and relentless encounters, but one specific battle stands out for its sheer, heavy physical consequence. It was the monumental duel with a famous giant named Hrungnir. This opponent was not a creature of soft flesh and warm, pumping blood. He was an ancient being constructed entirely of solid, unyielding stone. His massive, broad chest was carved directly from the deep, dark foundations of the primitive earth. His thick legs were towering pillars of rough gray granite that scraped against the sky. Deep inside his cold chest cavity, he possessed a heavy beating heart made entirely of sharp, jagged flint. When this monumental giant walked slowly across the harsh landscape, the ground trembled violently, and deep, dark cracks appeared instantly in the dry soil. He carried a weapon that was simply a massive, heavy whetstone normally used to sharpen the giant blades of the world. He was pure arrogance and brute physical force combined into a single, towering monument of dark stone. The confrontation was destined to be a massive collision of absolute extreme forces. Thor stood on the edge of the battlefield and felt the familiar heavy rage rising hot in his chest. He gripped the short iron handle of his star metal hammer and felt the raw electrical power humming against the thick skin of his iron gloves. He did not hesitate or wait for the giant of stone to make the first movement. He simply swung his heavy arm and hurled the cosmic weapon directly through the cold air. The hammer flew with the blinding speed of a lightning bolt tearing through a black sky. It left a trail of bright burning ozone and deafening thunder in its wake. The giant saw the burning metal approaching and reacted with the instinct of ancient stone. He lifted his massive, heavy whetstone club and threw it with all his monumental strength directly at the approaching hammer. The mid-air collision between the star metal hammer and the ancient stone club created one of the most spectacular and terrifying displays of raw kinetic power ever witnessed in the history of the Nine Worlds. The sound of the impact was not a simple crash. It was a deafening absolute roar that temporarily shattered the hearing of anyone standing for miles around the battlefield. The hammer did not slow down or alter its divine path for even a single fraction of a second. It completely annihilated the massive stone club upon contact. The dense whetstone shattered instantly into countless millions of sharp gray fragments that exploded violently outward in every possible direction. A massive cloud of pulverized rock dust expanded into the atmosphere and blotted out the light of the sun. One particularly large and jagged piece of the flying stone struck Thor directly in the center of his forehead with incredible, devastating force. The sharp rock embedded itself deeply into his divine skull and caused a brilliant flash of sudden, blinding pain. Despite the terrible head injury, the heavy iron hammer continued its unstoppable flight directly through the thick cloud of stone dust. It struck the giant exactly in the center of his solid granite face. The impact crushed the thick stone skull of the giant instantly. The towering monument of stone lost all its internal strength and began to slowly collapse downward. The death of the giant was accompanied by the sound of a mountain crumbling into a deep valley. The massive lifeless body crashed heavily onto the broken ground and sent a final powerful shockwave rippling outward through the dirt. But the victory was immediately followed by a sudden and terrifying complication. As the dead giant fell forward, his enormous heavy stone leg crashed down directly across the throat and chest of the wounded thunder god. Thor was instantly pinned flat against the cold, hard earth beneath the crushing, unimaginable weight of the solid granite limb. You can imagine the sudden, suffocating panic of that specific moment. The great protector of the cosmos was trapped completely flat in the dirt, and he could not draw a proper breath into his compressed lungs. He pushed upward with all his legendary physical strength and strained every thick muscle in his broad back and massive arms. He pushed until his vision blurred and the blood pounded violently behind his eyes. But the dead stone legs simply would not move. It felt as though the entire weight of the planet had somehow settled directly onto his ribs. The other gods rushed frantically to the side of the battlefield and tried desperately to lift the massive stone limb. They pushed and pulled and used heavy wooden levers and chanted words of lifting magic, but nothing they tried had any effect at all. Thor lay trapped in the dirt for 3 long, agonizing days. He drifted in and out of a dark, feverish sleep, while the sharp piece of whetstone throbbed painfully in his wounded forehead. The terrifying, heavy situation was finally resolved in a very strange and humbling way. A young child walked slowly onto the ruined, dusty battlefield. It was Magni, the young son of the thunder god. He was still just a boy, and he had not yet grown into his full adult divine form. He walked quietly up to the massive dead giant and looked down at his trapped father in the dirt. He did not perform any complicated magic or ask for any assistance from the older, exhausted gods. He simply bent his small knees and reached down to grasp the rough gray surface of the massive stone leg with one single hand. With a casual and almost effortless motion, the boy lifted the unimaginable weight of the stone limb directly off the chest of his father. He tossed the heavy granite aside as if it were nothing more than a dry, hollow branch. The older gods stared in absolute silent shock at this impossible display of pure, raw, physical power. Thor took a deep, shuddering breath of the cool, dusty air and looked up at his young son with a mixture of deep pride and quiet awe. He slowly realized that true strength comes in many different forms, and that the future of the cosmos was safely resting in the hands of the next generation. The limits of absolute physical strength are rarely truly tested until they are broken completely against the immovable, mysterious forces of the deep cosmos. Thor always believed his power was absolute and undeniable until he traveled far into the hazy, misty eastern lands of deep illusion. He gathered a small traveling party of diverse companions, including the cunning trickster Loki and 2 agile mortal servants. They walked away slowly from the familiar safe paths of the mortal realm and entered a deeply unsettling and confusing landscape. The trees grew incredibly thick and twisted, their dark, heavy branches closely together to block out the comforting, warm light of the afternoon sun. The air became strangely heavy, and it smelled strongly of rotting, wet wood and ancient damp moss. They walked in total silence for several long, exhausting days through this oppressive and As the gray light faded slowly on a particularly exhausting and confusing day, they found themselves wandering blindly into a massive, empty cavern to seek shelter from the creeping, freezing cold of the long night. They huddled closely together in the absolute pitch dark and listened to a terrifying, rhythmic rumbling sound that violently shook the hard ground beneath them all night long. When the pale gray morning light finally broke thinly through the dense forest canopy, they stepped outside and realized they had not slept inside a natural stone cave at all. They had unwittingly taken shelter inside the empty, dark thumb of a discarded heavy leather glove belonging to a giant of truly incomprehensible and terrifying proportions. They looked up and saw the owner of the glove sleeping peacefully on the forest floor. His physical body was so impossibly large that his massive head disappeared completely into the low-hanging morning clouds. When he breathed, his chest rose and fell with the slow, steady rhythm of tectonic plates grinding together deep beneath the ocean. This was the giant named Skrymir. His loud snoring was the source of the violent, terrifying earthquakes they had felt throughout the long, sleepless night. The giant eventually woke up and stretched his massive limbs. He looked down at the tiny traveling gods with a mild, sleepy curiosity. He casually offered to guide them to their final destination and placed all of their small provisions inside his own massive leather sack. The journey continued, but the absolute sheer scale of the massive giant made every single step feel entirely futile and deeply humiliating for the normally proud thunder god. When the deep night fell again, the giant lay down heavily on the hard ground and fell instantly into a deep, booming sleep. He had forgotten to untie the heavy leather sack of food, and the small gods could not loosen the massive, thick knots with their tiny hands. They were completely exhausted and incredibly hungry. Thor felt a familiar hot rage building slowly in his broad chest. He gripped the short iron handle of his star metal hammer and walked quietly over to the sleeping giant. He raised the devastating cosmic weapon high above his head and brought it crashing down directly onto the broad forehead of the snoring giant with all of his legendary physical strength. The impact was loud enough to shatter an entire mountain range into fine gray dust. The giant simply stirred slightly in his sleep and casually brushed his massive hand across his forehead. He mumbled sleepily that a small, dry leaf must have fallen from the high branches and landed on his face. The absolute shock and the cold, creeping realization of his own impotence washed over the thunder god like a bucket of freezing ocean water. He waited several long hours until the snoring grew deep and rhythmic again. He stepped forward and swung the heavy hammer a second time. He poured every single ounce of his divine fury and his magical strength into the downward blow. The giant simply opened one massive sleepy eye and quietly asked if a small acorn had perhaps dropped from the canopy above. He struck a third and final time just before the pale dawn broke over the horizon. He buried the heavy iron hammer so deeply into the cheek of the giant that the metal head disappeared completely from sight. The giant simply sat up slowly and rubbed his large face while complaining mildly that a small bird must have dropped a tiny twig from its high nest. The travelers realized with a cold, sinking dread that they were moving through a landscape that did not obey any of the normal laws of physical reality or divine power. They finally arrived at the massive, imposing gates of a fortress called Utgard. The sheer size of the stone walls was so immense that the travelers had to lean their heads entirely backward just to see the very top of the iron gates. They slipped quietly between the heavy iron bars and walked slowly into a vast, echoing hall. The king of this strange and possibly large realm was named Utgard Loki. He sat upon a towering throne of dark carved stone and looked down at the tiny visitors with a mocking, calculating smile. He casually informed them that nobody was allowed to remain in his high hall unless they could prove themselves to be the absolute master of some specific physical skill or unique talent. He challenged them to a series of strange, impossible contests designed to test the absolute breaking limits of their divine physical capabilities. Thor stepped forward and proudly demanded a contest of pure physical endurance. He boldly claimed that no living creature could drink more liquid or drink it faster than he could. The giant king smiled slowly and ordered his servants to bring forward a long, curved drinking horn made from the pale white bone of some ancient massive beast. The king casually explained that a truly strong man could drain the entire long horn in a single massive gulp. Thor gripped the smooth, cold bone of the horn and brought the wide rim to his dry lips. He tilted his head back and began to drink the cold, dark liquid. He swallowed with massive, rhythmic gulps. He poured the cold liquid down his throat with desperate, intense energy. The taste of the drink was strange and incredibly salty. It tasted exactly like the deep, freezing waters of the ancient dark ocean. He drank until his lungs burned desperately for air and his chest ached from the physical strain of swallowing. He lowered the heavy horn and wiped his wet mouth, expecting to see the vessel completely empty. He looked down into the wide mouth of the long horn and felt a cold, deep confusion wash over his tired mind. The level of the dark liquid had barely dropped at all. The giants in the hall laughed with a low rolling sound that vibrated in the stone floor. Thor refused to accept the humiliating failure. He lifted the heavy horn again and drank with an even greater furious determination. He drank until the muscles in his thick neck cramped painfully and his vision began to swim with dark spots. He pulled the horn away and gasped loudly for fresh air. The liquid had only dropped by the width of a single human finger. He tried one final desperate time. He closed his eyes and drank until he felt he would simply drown from the inside out. When he finally gave up and dropped the heavy horn to the stone floor, the liquid had shifted only slightly. The giant king mockingly suggested a second, much easier challenge. He pointed casually to a large gray cat that was sleeping lazily on the warm stone floor near the burning hearth. He suggested that perhaps the mighty thunder god could simply lift the sleeping pet from the ground as a minor display of his fading strength. Thor walked over to the lazy gray feline and placed one large hand under its soft, warm belly. He expected to toss the small animal easily into the high rafters of the hall. He pulled upward with a quick, casual motion. The cat did not move. The soft body simply stretched downward toward the floor like thick, heavy dough. Thor planted his heavy boots firmly on the stone tiles and gripped the animal with both of his thick hands. He pulled upward with the exact same straining force he used to lift heavy boulders and fallen trees. The soft gray fur slipped through his fingers, and the back of the cat arched high into the air, but the paws remained firmly glued to the stone floor. The sheer physical weight of the small animal was totally incomprehensible. It felt as though he was trying to deadlift the entire solid mass of the planet beneath his feet. He strained until the thick veins in his broad neck bulged outward and the heavy sweat poured down his red face. With an agonizing final desperate heave, he managed to lift exactly one single small paw, fraction of an inch off the cold stone floor. He collapsed backward, completely exhausted and totally humiliated by a simple sleeping house cat. The final, ultimate humiliation came when he angrily demanded to wrestle anyone in the vast hall to prove his actual worth in physical combat. The king smiled a very sad and quiet smile. He called forward an old, decrepit woman named Ellie. She was severely hunched over, and her thin, pale skin was covered in deep wrinkles. She looked frail and entirely brittle, like a dried autumn leaf that would crumble to fine dust in a strong wind. Thor hesitated because he did not want to accidentally break the fragile bones of the ancient woman. But she stepped forward and gripped him tightly by the heavy belt. Her thin, bony hands felt completely cold and unyielding, like bands of solid forged iron. Thor tried to gently push her backward to end the sad contest quickly. She did not move. She stood perfectly still, like a deeply rooted ancient oak tree in a heavy storm. He pushed harder and shifted his heavy weight to throw her to the stone floor. The old woman simply flowed around his aggressive movements and shifted her own slight weight with a terrifying, impossible grace. She applied a slow, cold, continuous pressure against his broad chest. It was not a violent, sudden attack. It was a creeping, inevitable weight that felt exactly like the slow passage of long centuries. Thor fought desperately against the creeping pressure. He dug his heavy boots into the stone floor and locked every thick muscle in his broad legs. But the cold, heavy weight of the old woman continued to push him slowly, steadily downward. He felt his absolute divine strength bleeding away into the cold air. He felt heavy and old and profoundly, deeply tired. With a final, slow, quiet movement, the fragile old woman forced the mighty god of thunder down onto one single knee. He knelt on the hard stone floor, completely defeated and totally stripped of his legendary, arrogant pride. The giant king eventually led them out of the massive gates and explained the deep, magical illusions. The horn was magically connected directly to the vast, endless oceans of the world. Thor had actually lowered the sea level and created the tides with his massive, desperate drinking. The gray cat was actually the massive World Serpent, disguised by deep magic. Thor had lifted a creature that wrapped completely around the entire globe, and the fragile old woman was the literal physical manifestation of old age itself. No one and nothing can ever defeat the slow, creeping, inevitable pressure of time. Thor listened to the explanations in absolute silence. He realized that pure physical strength is a very small and fragile thing when compared to the vast, deep concepts of the ancient universe. You can feel that same creeping, quiet realization settling slowly over your own tired thoughts. The struggle against time and gravity is always meant to be eventually surrendered. Let your heavy limbs give up their long fight and allow the deep, pulling weight of the soft bed to hold you perfectly still. You do not need to lift the heavy burdens of the world tonight. You just need to close your eyes and let the slow, inevitable quiet wash over you completely. The heavy atmospheric illusions of the massive giant king finally faded away into the cold morning mist as Thor returned slowly to the grounded physical reality of the mortal realm. He did not spend all of his eternal days fighting massive cosmic battles or drinking sweet mead in the high golden halls of the sky gods. The actual truth of his daily existence was much more repetitive and much more intimately tied to the dirty, wet soil of the earth. He was the designated heavy protector of the fragile human world, known as Midgard. The simple people of the earth did not need a brilliant philosopher or a silent, distant watcher floating in the clouds. They desperately needed a massive, aggressive guard dog standing firmly at the wooden gate. They needed a heavy, calloused hand to forcefully keep the creeping monsters hidden in the dark shadows where they truly belonged. Thor understood this relentless physical burden deeply in his thick bones. He walked across the vast mortal lands with a slow and incredibly deliberate heavy pace. He frequently left his loud flying chariot behind and placed his heavy leather boots directly onto the wet, sinking soil of the farmer fields. The rain was falling constantly and rhythmically on this particular dark night. It was a cold and steady, heavy rain that soaked entirely through the thick, coarse wool tunics of the working humans and turned the dry dirt roads into deep, sluggish rivers of thick brown mud. You can easily hear the mesmerizing rhythmic sound of the heavy raindrops striking the wet, yielding earth over and over again. It is a slow, hypnotic, natural pattern of falling water meeting soft soil. Thor walked silently through the endless freezing downpour, and he did not seek any temporary shelter from the violent storm. The massive storm was essentially his own creation and his own element. The cold water running down his broad, scarred face and soaking deeply into his thick red beard was a vital, necessary part of the eternal cycle of natural life. The fragile humans huddled closely together inside their small dark homes made of baked mud and dried straw. They listened quietly to the heavy, deep thunder rolling aggressively across the black night sky, and they felt a profound, deep sense of absolute physical safety. The loud thunder was not a terrifying sound of incoming destruction to them. It was simply the comforting, heavy footsteps of their great, immortal protector marching across the heavens to chase away the terrifying things that always hide in the total dark. He walked slowly past a small, lonely wooden farm situated at the very edge of a great, dense, ancient forest. The dark forest was incredibly old and filled with creeping, hungry things that absolutely hated the warm, flickering light of human hearth fires. Thor stopped his march and stood completely still in the middle of the pouring, freezing rain. He watched the small, warm orange glow of the firelight leaking slowly out through the narrow cracks in the wooden shutters of the simple farmhouse. He raised his heavy, dark iron hammer in his thick, leather-gloved hands. He did not swing the cosmic weapon to destroy or to shatter the earth. He simply held it out horizontally and channeled a very low and incredibly gentle electrical current directly through the dark, dense star metal. The wet night air immediately around the small farm began to smell sharply of clean, burnt ozone and fresh, pure rain. A soft, completely invisible wave of protective divine energy settled gently over the wet plowed fields. The dark soil greedily absorbed the electrical energy, and the tiny sleeping seeds buried beneath the dirt grew slightly warmer and more vibrant. This was the quiet, hidden blessing of the terrifying thunder god. He provided the loud, violent storms that brought the necessary life-giving water to the dry, desperate earth. His beautiful wife, Sif, physically represented the tall, swaying golden wheat and the fertile, yielding soil of the entire world. The intimate relationship between the violent storm and the quiet harvest was the very foundation of all mortal survival. The heavy, violent rain of the powerful god mixed perfectly with the soft, welcoming earth of the goddess to create the essential food that kept the frail humans alive through the brutal, freezing winter months. The long, silent patrol continued forward into the deeper and much darker parts of the ancient winding woods. The heavy rain could not fully penetrate the thick green canopy of the massive, towering old oak trees. The ground here in the deep woods was covered entirely in a thick, soft layer of rotting brown leaves and decaying fallen wood. The smell was incredibly dense and heavy, with the pungent scent of wet fungus and ancient damp earth that had not seen the sun in decades. Thor was actively hunting in this dark place. He was looking specifically for the cruel creatures that crept out of the deep, rocky caves only when the warm sun went completely down. He was hunting for the trolls. These beings were not the massive, towering cosmic giants that threatened the very magical structure of the universe. These were much smaller and much more intimately cruel monsters. They had thick, lumpy gray skin that looked exactly like rough, unpolished stone, and they possessed a cunning and deeply malicious predatory intelligence. They lived in the completely dark, hidden spaces under the rocky hills, and they aggressively hunted the mortal humans who foolishly wandered too far from the safety of their village fires. Thor moved through the dark, dense forest with a surprising and terrifying absolute silence. His massive physical bulk somehow did not disturb a single fallen brown leaf or break a single dry wooden twig under his heavy boots. He was the ultimate apex predator, walking confidently in his own dark domain. He eventually found a dark, jagged opening hidden in the side of a steep rocky hill. The incredibly foul smell of rotting meat and stagnant, toxic water poured out of the cave entrance like a physical, heavy fog. Thor gripped the short, thick handle of his iron hammer and stepped confidently into the absolute pitch-black void of the cavern. He did not need any torch or magical light to see his way forward. He could easily feel the shape of the dark enclosed space through the subtle shifts in the air pressure and the faint rhythmic echoes of water dripping slowly from the damp stone ceiling. He clearly heard the low, wet, panicked breathing of the trolls, hiding desperately in the deepest shadows of the cave. They incorrectly thought they were perfectly safe in their dark, hidden stone home. They did not realize that the violent storm had silently followed them all the way underground. Thor did not offer any loud warning or make any grand heroic speeches to the monsters in the dark. He simply swung the heavy star metal hammer in a wide, devastating, and unstoppable arc. The dark, cursed iron connected violently with the solid stone wall of the cave and released a sudden blinding flash of pure, brilliant white lightning. The sudden, intense electrical light illuminated the horrifying, panicked faces of the monsters for a single, terrible fraction of a second. The deafening, sharp crack of the enclosed thunder completely shattered the thick stone pillars that were supporting the heavy cave roof. The massive weight of the earth collapsed rapidly downward and buried the cruel creatures instantly in a permanent crushing tomb of solid dark rock. Thor walked slowly and calmly out of the settling gray dust and stepped back into the cool, cleansing night rain. Another small but deadly threat to the fragile mortal world had been permanently and silently erased from existence. The mortal humans could not physically see him walking through the dark woods, but they knew deep in their bones that he was always out there watching over them. They felt his heavy, comforting presence in the changing of the agricultural seasons and the shifting of the seasonal winds. To properly honor their silent, violent protector, the mortal blacksmiths worked tirelessly in their own small hot village forges. They took small, raw pieces of dark iron and bright, shining silver, and they heated the metal over roaring red coal fires. They carefully hammered the glowing soft metal into the exact shape of a tiny, blunt weapon. They created thousands of small, heavy personal amulets, shaped exactly like the legendary devastating hammer of the thunder god. The mortal people wore these small, heavy metal hammers tied securely to simple, rough leather cords resting perfectly flat against their bare chests. The metal quickly absorbed the natural warmth of their human skin and provided a constant physical and psychological reminder of their incredibly powerful guardian. When a lonely farmer walked alone through the dark, empty fields at night, he would instinctively reach up and touch the small, cold iron hammer resting directly over his beating heart. The simple, tactile, physical sensation of the smooth, hard metal provided a deep, profound psychological comfort in the face of the terrifying unknown. It was a literal physical connection to the massive divine strength that held the chaotic universe together and kept the freezing monsters at bay. You can imagine the comforting feeling of that small, heavy iron amulet resting gently against your own chest right now as you lie in the dark. It is a dense, stabilizing physical weight that automatically grounds your floating, anxious thoughts and pulls you back to the safe, present moment. The ancient mortal people slept very soundly in their drafty wooden homes because they believed absolutely that the god of thunder was awake and actively walking the dangerous borders of the world. You do not need to stay awake and guard your own tired mind tonight. The heavy patrols have already been fully completed by a force much stronger than your own anxiety. Listen closely to the rhythmic, hypnotic sound of the rain falling gently against the soft earth outside your window. It is a slow, constant white noise whisper that gently washes away all the complicated and loud thoughts of the busy waking day. Let your own tired mind sink down slowly into that same dark, quiet, and peaceful place. There is absolutely no danger waiting for you in the deep, soft soil. There is only the long, slow, comfortable wait for the warm, bright morning sun to eventually return. The absolute panic that comes from losing the most important thing in the world does not always start with a loud scream. Sometimes it begins with a very quiet and deeply terrifying empty space in the dark. Thor awoke slowly from a very long and incredibly deep sleep in his massive chambers, located high in the shining fortress of Asgard. The air in the stone room was perfectly still and exceptionally cold. He reached his thick, heavy hand out blindly over the side of his massive wooden bed toward the familiar solid stone table, where he always rested his magical weapon. His thick, calloused fingers expected to brush against the cold, dense, unyielding iron of the short hammer handle. He expected to feel the low, constant electrical hum of the star metal vibrating against his bare skin. Instead, his large hand swept through nothing but empty, freezing air. He blinked his tired eyes and sat up slowly in the quiet darkness of the room. He reached out again and patted the flat surface of the stone table. There was absolutely nothing there. The table was completely bare. The heavy dread began to sink like a massive cold stone directly into the very bottom of his stomach. He pushed himself out of the large bed and stood on the freezing stone floor. He searched the entire room with a frantic, growing energy. He threw the heavy furs and the thick woolen blankets completely off the bed. He looked under the massive wooden frames and behind the heavy woven tapestries hanging on the cold walls. The hammer was entirely, unequivocally gone. The terrifying reality of the situation was almost entirely impossible for his mind to properly process. The great hammer Mjolnir was not simply a physical tool that could be easily replaced by visiting the dwarven forges again. It was the literal physical anchor of the entire cosmic defense system. Without that specific heavy iron weapon, he was still incredibly strong, but he could not summon the devastating electrical storms or shatter the skulls of the massive towering giants with a single perfectly aimed throw. He was suddenly and horribly vulnerable. The entire shining realm of Asgard was suddenly completely exposed to the creeping, freezing chaos waiting outside the golden walls. He quickly called for Loki, because the trickster was the only being in the 9 realms who truly understood the dark, complicated mechanics of theft and silent deception. Loki entered the cold room and immediately saw the raw, panicked devastation written clearly across the broad face of the Thunder God. Loki did not mock him or make any cruel jokes, because even the chaotic trickster understood perfectly that the total loss of the hammer meant absolute certain doom for all of them. Loki immediately suggested a desperate but necessary plan of action. He needed to perform a massive aerial reconnaissance to search the hostile territories of the enemies. Loki traveled quickly to the beautiful, fragrant chambers of the goddess Freya. She was the master of deep, powerful magic, and she possessed a magnificent magical cloak constructed entirely from the soft gray and brown feathers of a massive falcon. Loki borrowed the magical feather cloak and wrapped it tightly around his own shoulders. He stepped out onto the high golden balcony of the divine palace and leaped confidently into the freezing thin air. The magical cloak instantly transformed his physical body into a massive, incredibly fast bird of prey. He flapped the large feathered wings and flew rapidly away from the bright safety of Asgard. He flew directly over the massive, jagged, impassable mountain ranges that physically separated the realm of the gods from the dark, freezing territories of the giants. The wind at that high altitude was violently cold, and it whipped aggressively against his feathers. He flew over the desolate, rocky wastelands of Jotunheim, looking with his sharp bird eyes for any sign of the missing star metal. He eventually saw a massive, crude fortress carved directly into the side of a frozen gray mountain. Sitting casually on top of a massive burial mound outside the dark fortress was a truly enormous and ugly giant named Thrym. He was braiding golden collars for his giant, massive hunting dogs, and he looked entirely too pleased with himself. Loki landed silently on the frozen ground and transformed slowly back into his normal physical shape. He approached the giant king cautiously. Thrym did not look surprised to see the trickster arriving at his dark gates. The giant laughed with a low booming sound that physically shook the loose rocks on the ground. Thrym proudly and arrogantly confessed immediately that he was the one who had successfully stolen the legendary hammer of the Thunder God. He bragged loudly that he had buried the divine weapon exactly 8 miles deep beneath the solid frozen earth, where absolutely no one could ever hope to find it or dig it out. He stated his ultimate, absolute ransom demand with a cruel and highly confident smile. He would only return the devastating weapon to the desperate gods if they agreed to give him the beautiful goddess Freya to be his personal giant bride. The sheer, absolute audacity of the demand was completely staggering to the mind. Freya was not a simple trading commodity or a weak, helpless prize to be bartered away to a filthy monster. She was a fiercely independent and incredibly powerful entity who commanded the magic of life and death. Loki nodded slowly and suppressed his own rising anger. He turned around and immediately flew rapidly back over the freezing mountains to deliver the terrible, insulting news to the desperate waiting gods. When Loki returned to the Golden Halls and presented the ransom demand to Freya, her reaction was entirely terrifying to behold. She did not simply weep or politely decline the horrible, monstrous proposal. She absolutely exploded with a deep, blinding fury that shook the entire structure of the divine palace. Her intense magical anger was so completely profound and physically violent that the massive golden necklace she always wore around her throat violently snapped into pieces. The heavy, priceless jewels scattered loudly and aggressively across the hard stone floor. She screamed that she would literally rather be thrown alive into the freezing void than ever allow herself to be dragged away to marry a filthy, disgusting giant in the dark, frozen wastes. Her absolute refusal left the gods completely paralyzed with fear and indecision. They sat heavily in their massive, carved chairs in the great council hall and stared blankly in total, absolute silence. They could not physically attack the giant fortress because they did not have their greatest magical weapon. They could not agree to the ransom because the fierce goddess would absolutely never comply. They were completely and utterly trapped in a fatal, impossible logic puzzle. The silence in the grand hall was finally broken by a relatively quiet and extremely clever god named Heimdall. He nervously proposed a plan that was so completely humiliating and absolutely absurd that the other gods initially thought he was making a terrible, inappropriate joke. Heimdall suggested that they simply dress the massive, muscular thunder god in the delicate bridal clothes of Freya. They could cover his broad, thick chest with shining, beautiful jewels and drape a massive, heavy veil entirely over his bearded face. They could send him directly into the giant fortress, pretending to be the highly anticipated beautiful bride. Once he was inside the hall and completely surrounded by the unsuspecting, arrogant giants, he could simply wait for the moment they brought the hammer out to bless the false marriage. The thunder god immediately and loudly protested this deeply humiliating plan. He roared that the other masculine gods would constantly mock him forever if he ever allowed himself to be forcefully dressed in soft women's clothing and treated like a delicate, helpless bride. He felt the hot, shameful blood rushing quickly to his angry face. But the cunning trickster Loki immediately completely agreed with the clever plan. Loki firmly and coldly reminded the angry thunder god that if he did not swallow his massive, towering pride and put on the delicate dress, the giants would simply invade their unprotected home and burn the beautiful halls of Asgard to the ground. The harsh, absolute reality of the fatal situation finally broke through the stubborn pride of the heavy warrior. Thor slowly and incredibly reluctantly agreed to endure the massive humiliation for the ultimate safety of the entire fragile world. The profoundly uncomfortable and totally bizarre process of disguising the most masculine heavy warrior in the universe as a beautiful, delicate bride took many long, agonizing hours. The serving women of the palace brought out yards and yards of the finest, softest white silk and incredibly delicate imported linen. They wrapped the soft, expensive fabrics tightly around the incredibly broad, muscular chest and the thick, heavy thighs of the furious god. Every time he flexed a massive muscle, the delicate seams of the beautiful clothing threatened to tear completely apart. They strapped a tight, restrictive corset around his incredibly wide waist to try to mimic a softer, feminine shape. The tight bindings made it very difficult for his massive lungs to draw a proper deep breath. They took the broken pieces of Freya's heavy, famous magical necklace and reassembled it tightly around his thick, muscular neck. The heavy, glittering jewels rested very awkwardly against his prominent collarbone. To completely hide his famous bright red beard and his angry, burning eyes, they draped a very large, thick, opaque veil entirely over his head. He could barely see through the heavy, restrictive fabric. He felt completely constrained and entirely ridiculous. He stood stiffly in the center of the room, looking like a massive, terrifying mountain completely covered in delicate white lace. Loki also disguised himself quietly as a polite, humble serving maid so he could closely accompany the false bride and do all the necessary smooth talking when they arrived at the giant stronghold. They descended from the high heavenly realms in the heavy wooden chariot pulled by the magical flying goats. The journey was incredibly uncomfortable for the heavily disguised god. The delicate, soft silks scratched irritatingly against his rough, calloused skin, and the tight, heavy corset pinched his sides violently with every single bump in the road. He sat rigidly in the back of the bouncing chariot, gripping the wooden sides with his large, hidden hands. He focused absolutely all of his raging internal energy entirely on the upcoming promise of sudden, extreme violence. He repeated the image of his heavy hammer in his mind over and over again to keep from tearing the humiliating, delicate clothes directly off his own body. They finally arrived at the massive, imposing gates of the dark giant fortress in the cold, rocky wasteland. But Giant King Thrym was absolutely overjoyed and entirely foolish. He had ordered his servants to prepare a truly massive, disgusting feast to properly welcome his beautiful new delicate bride. The great hall of the fortress was completely packed with hundreds of loud, ugly, arrogant giants who were drinking heavily and boasting loudly about their total victory over the helpless, weak gods. Thor and Loki were led to the very head of the massive wooden feasting table. Thor sat heavily in the large carved chair and stared silently out through the thick fabric of his heavy white veil. The smell of the roasted meats and the spilled sour ale in the crowded hall was entirely overwhelming to his keen senses. The giants brought out massive wooden platters, overflowing with roasted whole animals and entire massive barrels of dark, strong mead. Thor was incredibly hungry from the long, tense journey and the sheer stress of the terrible, humiliating disguise. He completely forgot to act like a shy, delicate bride. He reached out with his large hidden hands and grabbed an entire roasted ox. He devoured the massive animal completely in just a few huge, terrifying bites. He then ate 8 whole massive salmon and completely finished every single sweet pastry that had been carefully prepared for all the female guests. He then grabbed 3 entire heavy barrels of strong, dark mead and drank them entirely dry in a matter of a few short seconds. The giant King Thrym stared at the massive pile of bare bones and empty barrels in absolute total shock. He asked loudly how a delicate, beautiful, magical goddess could possibly eat and drink with the ravenous, terrifying appetite of a starving wild beast. The clever trickster Loki immediately stepped forward in his own disguise, as the humble serving maid and smoothly answered the suspicious king. Loki lied beautifully and stated that the poor bride had been so incredibly excited and deeply anxious about the wonderful upcoming marriage that she had entirely refused to eat or drink anything at all for 8 full days and nights. The foolish, arrogant king was deeply flattered by this excellent lie. He leaned forward closely and tried to lift the edge of the thick white veil to steal a quick kiss from his beautiful new starving bride. As he leaned closely in, he made direct, terrifying eye contact with the furious thunder god. The eyes of Thor were literally glowing with a hot, burning, bright red, furious energy that looked exactly like a blazing fire. The giant king jumped backward in absolute terror and asked why the eyes of the beautiful bride were burning with such a terrifying, hateful red light. Loki stepped in smoothly once again and calmly explained that the poor bride had also completely refused to sleep for 8 full days because she was so overwhelmingly eager to finally arrive at the giant hall. The king was once again completely satisfied and totally pacified by the clever, flattering explanation. The arrogant king finally loudly declared that it was time to properly bless the wonderful holy marriage. He proudly ordered his servants to bring out the stolen ultimate prize. The heavy iron doors of the vault were opened, and the servants carried out the legendary star metal hammer Mjolnir. They walked slowly over to the head of the long table. The king ordered them to place the heavy divine weapon gently into the lap of the beautiful, delicate bride, to formally consecrate their new eternal union. The servants lowered the massive, heavy, dark iron hammer and rested it gently on top of the soft, delicate white silk covering the thick, muscular legs of the disguised god. The very absolute second the cold, familiar, dark iron touched his covered skin, a massive, overwhelming surge of pure, intense joy and absolute, terrifying power washed entirely over his mind and his heavy body. The humiliating, tight corset and the scratching, delicate silk no longer mattered at all. He had his weapon back. He slowly wrapped his thick, large fingers tightly around the incredibly familiar short iron handle. The dark star metal recognized its true master immediately, and it began to hum violently with a terrifying, static electrical charge. Thor did not hesitate or wait for the giant to speak another foolish word. He stood up violently and completely shattered the heavy wooden table with his knees. He tore the thick, suffocating white veil completely off his bearded face and revealed his blazing red, furious eyes to the terrified room. He swung the massive, heavy iron hammer in a devastatingly fast and brutally precise arc. He struck the arrogant giant king Thrym directly in the center of his skull and instantly crushed him into the stone floor with the terrifying, deafening sound of a massive thunderbolt. The sudden absolute violence was completely overwhelming and totally inescapable. The room erupted into absolute panic as the false bride began a methodical, terrifying, and incredibly thorough reckoning. Thor moved through the crowded hall of giants like an unstoppable natural disaster of pure, heavy iron and blinding white lightning. He smashed the pillars and he shattered the stone walls, and he completely annihilated every single giant who had foolishly dared to attend the mocking wedding feast. The humiliating, delicate white bridal silk was quickly covered entirely in the dark, heavy dust of the completely destroyed fortress. When the terrifying, roaring storm of his absolute vengeance finally ended, he stood quietly alone in the massive, quiet ruins of the hall. He breathed slowly and heavily as he felt the perfect, comforting, heavy weight of the iron hammer resting safely in his familiar hand once again. The world was properly ordered and totally safe once more. The stolen power had returned home to the heavy hands of its rightful master. You can feel that same deep, profound sense of returned safety and absolute final resolution settling gently into your own tired mind. The dangerous, uncomfortable disguise can finally be completely stripped away and discarded into the dark. You can finally be entirely yourself in the quiet safety of the deep night. Let the heavy, comforting weight of the blankets press you down softly into the mattress. The long, tense, dangerous day is completely, utterly over. There is absolutely nothing left to fight and nothing left to hide. Sleep now in the heavy, quiet peace of the fully restored world. The deep ocean is a place of absolute, terrifying darkness and crushing heavy pressure. It is a massive, silent void that covers the fragile earth and hides the most ancient secrets of the world. Long before the final battles were ever fought, the high gods recognized a terrible, creeping threat growing slowly in the dark shadows of their perfect creation. The trickster Loki had fathered a monstrous child with a giantess of the wild lands. This child was not a god or a man, but a serpent of pure, chaotic potential. The gods looked at the small, writhing creature and felt a deep, cold dread settling heavily into their stomachs. They knew the ancient prophecies whispered by the weavers of fate. They knew this specific creature was destined to become the ultimate, eternal enemy of the great thunder god. Odin, the master of far-seeing wisdom, decided to remove the creeping threat from the warm lands of the sun. He took the young serpent and cast it far out into the deep, freezing waters of the great ocean that completely surrounded the mortal world. But the deep ocean did not destroy the creature at all. The cold, dark water nurtured the serpent and allowed it to grow at a terrifying, unnatural pace. The magical energies of the deep sea fed the monster, and it expanded year after year and century after century. It grew so incredibly massive that it eventually wrapped its long, heavy body completely around the entire globe of the earth. It grew until it finally reached its own enormous tail and grasped it firmly in its own massive jaws. The serpent formed a living, breathing ring of toxic muscle and heavy armored scales that permanently contained the mortal world. It lay silently in the deep oceanic trenches and slept in the freezing black mud. When it shifted its massive coils in its sleep, the movement created terrifying underwater mountains and caused massive tidal waves to crash heavily against the distant shores of the human world. This was Jormungandr, the great World Serpent. It was the literal physical embodiment of the creeping entropy that constantly waits patiently at the absolute very edge of the ordered universe. Thor knew that their final, eternal conflict was absolutely inevitable, but his deep warrior instincts drove him to seek out the danger long before the final appointed time. He decided to travel far out into the deep waters to pull the massive, creeping threat directly up from the black mud. He traveled alone to the high, rocky, coastal fortress of an ancient giant named Hymir. This giant was a master of the deep sea, and he possessed a massive, heavy wooden fishing boat built to withstand the terrifying, crushing weight of the open ocean. Thor arrived at the cold stone hall of the giant and demanded to join him on a long fishing expedition. The giant looked at the disguised god and laughed a low, rumbling laugh. He believed Thor was just a normal youth who would quickly freeze to death in the cold salt spray of the violent sea. The giant told his unexpected guest to go and find his own bait for the long, deep fishing trip. Thor walked purposefully out into the high green pastures surrounding the cold stone fortress. He found a herd of massive wild black oxen grazing peacefully in the thick, wet grass. He looked at the largest and most powerful bull in the entire heavy herd. He simply reached out with his thick, bare hands and grasped the massive, heavy horns of the giant black beast. He used his absolute raw physical strength to forcefully tear the enormous head completely away from the thick neck of the struggling animal. He carried the massive bleeding head of the black bull back down to the rocky shore where the giant was preparing the heavy wooden boat. The giant looked at the enormous bloody bait and felt a very sudden creeping chill of pure absolute terror wash slowly over his cold skin. He suddenly realized that his strange, quiet guest possessed a deeply unnatural and terrifying physical strength. They pushed the massive, heavy wooden boat off the sharp gray rocks and out into the freezing gray water of the early morning sea. They began to row together in a steady, slow, hypnotic rhythm. The thick wooden oars dipped deeply into the freezing salt water and pulled forcefully against the heavy ocean current. The sound of the oars moving through the water was a slow, steady splashing noise that lulled the mind into a quiet, deep trance. The boat moved rapidly away from the safety of the solid, rocky shore. The tall, gray mountains of the land slowly shrank and faded entirely away into the thick, white morning fog. The color of the vast ocean around them slowly began to change as they moved further and further away from the shallow coastal waters. The pale gray water turned into a deep, rich shade of dark blue, and then it eventually turned into a completely absolute and terrifying shade of pure black. They were floating quietly over the deepest hidden trenches of the ancient world, where the light of the sun could never ever reach. The giant stopped rowing and nervously stated that they had reached the absolute furthest limit of safe fishing. He warned that if they went any further out into the dark, they would enter the forbidden territory of the great World Serpent. Thor simply ignored the terrified warning and continued to row with massive, slow pulls of his thick, muscular arms. The heavy wooden boat surged further and further out into the completely unknown void of the deep ocean. Thor finally stopped rowing and let the heavy wooden oars rest quietly against the damp sides of the cold boat. The silence of the deep, open ocean was entirely profound and totally absolute. There was no sound of wind or crying seabirds. There was only the gentle, slow rocking of the small wooden boat on the massive flat surface of the black water. Thor slowly prepared his heavy fishing line. It was an incredibly thick, coarse rope woven from the strongest natural fibers of the earth and magically reinforced to withstand the pulling weight of a falling mountain. He took an enormous, heavy iron hook forged in the deep fires of the earth and drove it forcefully through the thick bone and muscle of the bleeding black ox head. He stood up slowly in the rocking boat and threw the massive, heavy bait far out over the dark, freezing water. The large, bloody head hit the flat surface of the ocean with a loud, heavy splash and began to sink rapidly down into the pitch-black abyss. The thick, coiled rope unspooled quickly from the wooden floor of the boat. It went down deeper and deeper into the freezing dark. It passed through the cold layers of the upper ocean where the normal fish swim. It passed down into the freezing, crushing depths where the strange, blind, glowing creatures hide from the light. It sank all the way down into the absolute freezing black mud of the deep ocean floor. Thor sat down heavily on the wet wooden bench and wrapped the thick, rough rope tightly around his two massive iron-covered hands. He braced his thick, heavy boots against the wooden floorboards of the small boat and simply waited in the total, absolute quiet. Down in the absolute freezing, crushing dark of the ocean floor, the great world serpent was slowly waking from a long, deep sleep. It smelled the rich, fresh blood of the black ox head drifting slowly through the cold, toxic water. The massive, ancient creature uncoiled a small section of its impossible heavy body and moved slowly toward the heavy, sinking bait. The serpent did not possess the cautious fear of a normal animal. It was a creature of pure, absolute arrogance and chaotic supreme power. It opened its massive, terrifying jaws and swallowed the enormous black ox head completely whole. The sharp, heavy iron hook immediately caught deep and hard inside the thick, muscular roof of the mouth of the giant monster. The sudden, sharp, piercing pain shocked the great serpent, and it reacted with a sudden, violent thrashing movement that disturbed the entire ocean floor. Up on the small wooden boat, Thor felt the sudden, incredibly heavy tension violently snap the thick rope completely taut. The heavy rope hummed and vibrated with the terrifying pulling weight of the massive cosmic beast. Thor leaned back and pulled forcefully against the heavy, thick rope. He channeled every single ounce of his absolute divine physical strength into his broad, thick shoulders and his massive back. The sudden, intense pulling force was so incredibly extreme that his two heavy leather boots instantly crashed completely through the solid wooden floorboards of the heavy boat. His feet pushed directly through the bottom of the boat and planted themselves firmly on the actual solid bedrock of the ocean floor below the vessel. He was standing on the actual bottom of the sea and pulling upward with the strength of a dying star. The ocean surface immediately began to boil and churn with incredible, violent white foam. The sky above grew completely dark, and heavy, gray storm clouds rushed rapidly together to cover the sun. The heavy, thick rope creaked and groaned loudly under the impossible tearing strain. Thor pulled and pulled with a slow, agonizing, continuous effort. He was literally dragging the physical embodiment of chaotic entropy up from the safe, dark deep. The freezing black water finally broke wide open, and the terrifying, massive head of the great world serpent breached the violent surface of the churning ocean. The sheer, absolute scale of the creature was completely impossible for a normal mind to properly comprehend. Its eyes were the size of dark mountainous lakes, and they burned with an ancient, deep, malevolent, glowing green light. Thick, heavy ropes of toxic green venom dripped slowly from its massive, jagged black teeth and sizzled loudly as they hit the cold salt water. The terrible, foul smell of the poisonous breath completely overwhelmed the clean smell of the ocean air. Thor stared directly into the massive, burning green eyes of his absolute, eternal enemy. He felt a deep surge of pure, hot, electrical hatred rushing rapidly through his thick veins. He dropped the heavy, coarse rope and quickly reached down to grasp the short iron handle of his devastating star metal hammer. He raised the cosmic weapon high above his head and prepared to deliver the absolute, final, crushing blow that would completely end the life of the massive, creeping monster. But the terrified giant, sitting in the broken boat, could not endure the absolute cosmic horror of the moment. He looked at the massive, towering head of the poisonous world serpent, and his mind completely and utterly broke under the crushing weight of pure, total fear. He pulled a small, sharp hunting knife from his thick leather belt and frantically slashed directly across the thick, heavy fishing rope that held the great monster tight. The thick fibers of the rope snapped violently apart with a loud, sharp cracking sound. The great world serpent immediately slipped backward and sank rapidly down into the dark, freezing, churning waters of the deep ocean. The massive head disappeared completely beneath the violent white foam, and the huge, heavy coils descended quickly back into the absolute safe darkness of the cold, crushing abyss. The great monster was completely gone in a matter of a few short seconds. Thor roared in absolute furious, deep frustration and swung his heavy iron hammer violently. But the massive target was already completely out of his long reach. The ultimate final battle had been temporarily delayed, but it had not been completely avoided. The great World Serpent was still out there waiting patiently in the freezing dark mud. The fragile world was still completely trapped in the slow, tightening coils of creeping, chaotic entropy. Thor pulled his heavy-booted feet out of the broken wooden floorboards of the sinking boat and stood quietly in the freezing, rushing water. The storm clouds above slowly began to part, and the pale gray light of the hidden sun returned quietly to the flat surface of the ocean. The heavy ocean water grew perfectly calm and completely still once again. You can feel that same incredibly deep, quiet silence settling very slowly and heavily over your own tired mind right now. The massive struggles and the heavy, terrifying monsters of your own long day have all sunk completely back down into the absolute dark depths where they truly belong. They cannot reach you here in the quiet, safe, shallow waters of your resting mind. The heavy pulling tension of the thick rope has been completely cut away and released forever. Your tired, heavy muscles do not have to strain or fight or pull against the terrible, unyielding weight of the world anymore. You are completely, totally free to let go of the heavy tools and just let the quiet, calm water gently support your exhausted, heavy body. The deep ocean is incredibly dark, but it is also perfectly and wonderfully quiet. There is no rushing wind or screaming fear down in the absolute deep dark. There is only the slow, gentle rocking motion of the calm, flat water. Let the slow, hypnotic rocking movement pull you gently down into a place of profound, deep, absolute peace. You are perfectly safe, and you are completely surrounded by the quiet, heavy, dark. The ancient gods fought their terrible cosmic battles so that you could rest peacefully in the quiet spaces between the storms. The heavy iron weapons are put away, and the giant monsters are sleeping in the mud far below the surface. You can close your heavy eyes and simply float on the gentle tide. Every single breath you take is a slow, deep wave washing over the quiet shores of your mind. In and out, rising and falling. Drift slowly downward into the comfortable shadows and let the vast ocean of sleep pull you completely under. The final conflict was always written in the deep roots of the ancient tree. It was never a question of if the world would eventually break. It was only ever a question of exactly when the final heavy winter would arrive. The ancient seers called it Ragnarok. It was the twilight of the bright gods and the complete, absolute destruction of the ordered, warm universe. The ancient seers had seen it in the shivering depths of the world, in the deep cracks running through the bark of the great tree, in the way the ravens of Odin circled lower and lower over the golden halls with a strange new heaviness in their dark wings. Thor had always known this day was coming. The weavers of fate had whispered it long before he had drawn his first rumbling breath. He had carried this knowledge like a stone in the center of his chest for every single one of his long, immortal years. Every giant he had crushed, every monster he had buried, every dark cave he had cleared, and every winter storm he had unleashed on the desperate frozen fields had been part of the same slow march toward this single, unavoidable appointment. He did not fear it. He simply continued to work. He continued to walk the borders of the world and swing the heavy hammer and let the rain fall on the dry earth. He continued right up until the very last possible moment. That is the most profound thing about him. Not the strength or the lightning or the glowing red eyes burning through the dark. It is the fact that he simply kept walking forward even when he knew exactly how the long road ended. The terrible unmaking of the world did not begin with a sudden loud explosion or a massive violent battle. It began with a long, slow, creeping silence and a deep, terrifying cold that simply refused to ever leave. It began with the Fimbulwinter. This was not a normal seasonal winter that lasted for a few difficult cold months. This was a massive, crushing, endless winter that lasted for 3 full consecutive years without a single warm day of bright spring or green summer to break the freezing ice. The bright, warm sun grew pale and weak and finally faded away completely behind a thick, heavy, permanent blanket of dark gray clouds. The white snow fell continuously from the dark sky in massive, blinding, heavy sheets that buried the tall green trees and covered the high rocky mountains. The freezing, biting wind howled violently and aggressively across the dark, empty plains every single day and every single night. The oceans completely froze over and turned into vast, flat deserts of thick, jagged blue ice. The fragile, mortal humans huddled desperately inside their freezing wooden homes and watched their small, warm fires slowly die out and turn to cold gray ash. The extreme, absolute cold was a physical heavy weight that pressed down relentlessly on the fragile lungs and completely froze the warm blood in the slow veins. The strong bonds of warm human love and family loyalty completely broke down under the terrible, crushing weight of endless starvation and freezing dark despair. You can almost feel the deep, numbing cold of that ancient, terrible winter seeping very slowly into your own tired bones. But you are completely safe and fully protected inside your own warm, soft, comfortable bed. The freezing dark wind is completely locked outside your thick, solid walls. You can just listen to the slow, distant howling of the cold air and feel even more deeply grateful for the heavy, warm blankets that cover your resting body. When the 3 long years of absolute freezing winter were finally complete, the very fabric of the physical universe began to slowly tear completely apart. The massive invisible boundaries that separated the different realms of existence completely dissolved into absolute nothingness. The great world serpent Jormungandr awoke from its long, cold sleep in the deep ocean trench. It realized that the appointed time of absolute unmaking had finally arrived. It uncoiled its massive, heavy, impossible body and began to move rapidly toward the fragile surface of the world. The sheer massive physical volume of the creature moving upward displaced billions of tons of heavy ocean water. The oceans completely overflowed their ancient boundaries, and massive, terrifying dark tidal waves crashed violently over the high cliffs and swallowed the coastal human lands. The great serpent breached the surface of the boiling ocean and released a massive, terrifying roar that shattered the remaining ice. It breathed out a huge, thick, expanding cloud of purely toxic green venom that blew aggressively across the ruined landscape. The poisonous dark gas killed every single remaining green plant and poisoned all the fresh-flowing rivers of the earth. The air itself became a toxic burning fog. Thor stood quietly on the great final battlefield known as Vigrid. He watched the massive creeping clouds of green poison rolling slowly toward the ranks of the high gods. He knew exactly what he had to do. He gripped the short, dark handle of his heavy star metal hammer for the absolute final time. He did not feel any fear or any hesitation in his heavy chest. He only felt a deep, profound sense of ultimate eternal purpose. He walked slowly forward through the toxic green fog to meet his ancient eternal enemy. The great world serpent towered over him like a massive swaying mountain of heavy dark scales and dripping green fangs. The sheer size of the beast blocked out the pale gray light of the dying sky. The monster lunged downward with incredible, terrifying speed to crush the tiny god in its massive, rotting jaws. Thor did not step backward or try to evade the massive falling mountain of teeth and scale. He planted his heavy leather boots firmly into the dark, ruined ash of the battlefield. He channeled every single drop of his remaining divine magic and his absolute raw physical strength into his thick, tired arms. He swung the heavy iron hammer in a devastating, perfect upward arc. The dark star metal connected directly with the very center of the massive, thick skull of the falling serpent. The deafening, sharp crack of the absolute impact echoed across the entire dying universe. The sheer, unbelievable force of the divine blow completely shattered the thick, heavy bone of the monster and instantly severed its dark connection to the unholy life force that animated it. The massive, terrifying brain of the ancient creature was completely destroyed in a single glorious fraction of a second. The great world serpent collapsed heavily onto the ruined battlefield with the sound of a falling continent. The eternal enemy of the warm light was finally and completely dead. But the absolute victory was an incredibly tragic and heavy thing. As the massive serpent died, it released the full, entire concentration of its dark, toxic venom directly onto the great thunder god. A thick, heavy wave of burning green poison washed completely over his broad, strong chest and soaked deeply into his iron gloves. The foul, dark magic of the venom was so profoundly toxic that even his legendary divine constitution could not fight it off. The burning poison seeped directly into his thick blood and moved rapidly toward his strong beating heart. Thor felt the deep, heavy coldness of inevitable death creeping slowly into his massive, strong limbs. He turned his back on the enormous, dead carcass of the great serpent and began to slowly walk away through the thick, toxic fog. He took one heavy, slow step forward. The ground beneath his heavy boot cracked and crumbled into gray ash. He took a second slow step. His breathing became incredibly ragged and terribly shallow. He took a third heavy step. His massive arms grew numb and completely lost their feeling. He took a fourth slow step. His vision began to blur, and the dark sky turned entirely black. He took a fifth heavy step. The burning pain in his strong chest faded away into a deep, spreading cold. He took a sixth slow step. His incredible legendary strength finally completely abandoned him. He took a seventh heavy step. His thick knees buckled slightly under his own massive weight. He took an eighth slow step. The heavy iron hammer finally slipped completely from his numb fingers and fell heavily into the soft, dark ash of the battlefield. He took the ninth and absolute final slow step. His great, strong heart finally stopped beating in his massive chest. The protector of the cosmos slowly collapsed forward into the soft gray dust. The loud thunder stopped completely and forever. The entire universe fell into a deep, terrifying, and absolute total silence. The bright, warm stars fell slowly from the black sky like gentle tears of light. The great, raging fires of destruction burned out completely, and the dark, ruined earth sank slowly back down into the absolute freezing calm of the deep, endless ocean. There was nothing left but the quiet, heavy dark and the absolute total stillness of the void. The old, noisy, chaotic world was completely gone forever. But the ancient turning wheel of deep time never truly stops moving. It just turns incredibly slowly in the absolute dark. The great, long sleep of the ruined world lasted for an unknowable eternity of quiet peace. Then, very slowly, the dark water began to recede and drop away. A brand new, clean green earth rose gently and quietly out of the calm, flat ocean. The bright, warm sun returned to the pale blue sky and chased away the lingering shadows. The thick green grass grew tall and soft over the ancient buried battlefields. Two young gods walked slowly across the quiet, peaceful green fields of the New World. They were Magni and Modi, the surviving strong sons of the Thunder God. They walked in silence for a long time, listening to the extraordinary sound of birds calling to one another across a sky that had no storm clouds in it. They walked through the cool, clean smell of grass that had never been burned. They walked past rivers running perfectly clear over smooth, round stones, with nothing in their clean water but the reflection of the pale new sky. They looked down into the tall, soft grass and saw a heavy, dark object resting quietly in the fresh morning dew. It was the great star metal hammer Mjolnir. It was completely unharmed by the fire and the water and the darkness of the great ending. The young, strong gods reached down together and lifted the heavy iron weapon from the soft earth. The heavy legacy of warm protection and unyielding strength would continue forever in the quiet New World. The long, tragic cycle was finally and perfectly complete. It had always been heading here. The violence and the sorrow and the terrible 9 steps across the ruined ash were all part of what was needed to arrive at this clean, quiet morning. The sons of the Thunder God carried the hammer gently across the new fields and understood without speaking that they would keep walking the borders of the world, just as their father had always done, because some responsibilities are too important to ever set down for long. You can feel the exact same deep, beautiful quiet of that fresh new world blooming slowly in your own tired mind. The old broken worries of the long, difficult day have all burned away completely and sunk quietly into the dark, distant sea. You are resting peacefully in the fresh green dawn of a completely clean slate. The heavy iron hammer of your own daily burdens has been completely set down and left behind in the soft grass. Your tired body is absolutely free to rest and repair itself in the quiet, absolute safety of the dark, calm night. The hard, frozen ground of the world has been broken open, and the good, wet soil is ready to receive whatever comes next. You have done enough for today. You have carried enough. You have walked far enough. The borders are safe, and the fires are burning low, and the old stories have been told all the way to their long, beautiful end. Your only work now is to breathe slowly and let the dark come in around you like something gentle and familiar and very, very old. Like the earth itself, like the deep roots of the ancient tree reaching all the way down into the quiet dark that was here before anything else and will be here long after the last star has gone out. Rest now. You are held. You are safe. You are home in the dark. Let the slow, steady turning of the ancient universe rock you gently back and forth. You are completely safe and totally warm and absolutely ready to drift completely away. The great tree still stands in the dark. Its roots reach down into places where no light has ever traveled, and its branches reach up into spaces where no sound has ever echoed. You are one of the small, warm fires burning somewhere in the middle of it all, surrounded on every side by an ancient darkness that has been there long before you arrived and will be there long after you are gone. But that darkness is not empty, and it is not cold, and it does not wish you any harm. It is full of old stories and heavy iron weapons resting in the morning grass and the sound of rain falling on fields that are waiting to grow. Breathe in slowly. Breathe out. The old gods are walking their long patrol, and the hammer is back where it belongs, and the new world is green and quiet and entirely yours to rest inside of. There is nothing left to do tonight but sleep. Sleep well. Sleep deep Sleep long. Good night now.